Understanding basic photography exposure principles will greatly improve the photos you take for your online business because exposure is what controls the amount of light that is used to create a photo. And in this video, I'm going to explain the two key components that control exposure on all cameras, whether you're using a cell phone or a camera like this. And that's shutter speed and aperture. And we're gonna look at how these two settings control exposure and how they can change the characteristics of your photos. I'm also gonna explain a third setting that affects exposure called ISO. And at the end of the video, I'm gonna share a fourth way to control exposure that not a lot of people think of when they think of exposure. So definitely make sure to stick around for that. If this is your first time here, I'm Matt Donnelly from Online Business Tech. And on this channel, I do tech tutorials on the tools you need to succeed and grow your online business. So if you're an online business owner like myself, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any videos. And just so you guys know, I'm not a professional photographer, but I do use photography in my online businesses like my jewelry brand, as well as my other website where I teach 3D modeling. And I've also carried that knowledge to help my wife with her Etsy shop where she sells wreaths and home decor. So photography is something I use on at least a weekly basis in my various online businesses. So when you take a picture, the image sensor in the camera is exposed to a certain amount of light for a certain amount of time. And the more light is exposed to the sensor, the brighter the image will be. And the less light is exposed to the sensor, the darker the image will be. Now, most times when you take a photo, you want an image that has a nice balance of dark and bright areas, and that's what's called a well-exposed photo. And if you shoot on auto, what you're doing is you're depending on the software in the camera to automatically adjust the shutter speed, aperture, and other settings in order to end up with a well-exposed photo. So if a photo was underexposed, that means not enough light was captured, and we end up with parts of the image that are too dark or too noisy to recover in post-processing. Now, on the other hand, if a photo is overexposed, then we've allowed too much light onto the sensor, and that will give us blown out highlights, which is where the bright parts of the photo are actually so bright that they're beyond the range of light that the sensor can actually capture. So those pixels are recorded as pure white in the image. So there's no way to recover the detail in those areas. So that's why exposure is so important in photography, because even though we have the ability with all the great editing software and apps that we have to brighten or darken parts of a photo after the image has been taken, you're still limited by the range of brightness that the image sensor is capable of recording. So when people talk about dynamic range, that's exactly what they're referring to. It's the range of light that a camera can capture between the darkest part of a photo and the brightest part of a photo. So a camera with a higher dynamic range is much more desirable because it can collect much more usable information from all the light in a particular scene, so you get much more detail in both the bright areas and the dark areas. But even the best cameras still have a certain dynamic range that you must work within, so it's important to know how to control exposure in order to get a good image. So again, when you take a picture, you have an image sensor. Now, back in the day, this used to be like an actual piece of film, but all cameras nowadays all have a digital sensor. And that sensor is exposed to a certain amount of light, which is determined by the aperture, for a certain amount of time, which is determined by shutter speed. So to control the duration of time that the sensor is exposed to light, cameras have a shutter, which is literally like a plastic door that covers the sensor and blocks all light. Now, there are cameras like, the ones in your cell phone that have an electronic shutter, so those don't actually have a physical shutter. But when a picture is taken, that shutter door is opened for a brief moment of time, usually only like a fraction of a second, and the light is captured by the sensor to produce the image. Since shutter speed is a measurement of time, it's actually shown on your camera in seconds. So If your camera is set to 1/100, that's literally 1/100th of a second. You can have really fast shutter speeds like 1/6000th of a second. You can have 1/100th, 1/50th, 1/30th, 1 second, 5 second, 30 seconds, and even longer. So the higher the shutter speed, the quicker the shutter will close after it's been opened, which means only a little bit of light will get in to the sensor. So you need more light in the scene in order to have a good photo. So for example, outdoor photography in direct sunlight will need a faster shutter speed due to the brightness of the sun, as opposed to a slower shutter speed where the shutter will let in more light over a longer period of time, which is good for low light shooting like night shots or astrophotography. So remember, shutter speed controls the duration of your exposure. Now, if shutter speed was the only parameter we had to control how much light hits the sensor, we'd be really limited in the types of pictures we could take, because slower shutter speeds naturally cause more motion blur in the photo. So when you take a picture of a moving object at a slow shutter speed, the position of the object when the shutter opened will be quite different from the position of the object when the shutter closed. But since light from the object has been hitting the sensor for that entire duration, the object appears blurry. So if you wanted to take a picture of a moving object without motion blur, you'd have to increase the shutter speed so the image sensor only sees the subject for a very small moment of time. But as a result of increasing the shutter speed, the image will become darker because you're decreasing the amount of time the sensor is exposed to light. So what we need is another way to compensate for this in order to allow a larger quantity of light to hit the sensor in this shorter amount of time. And that is where aperture comes in. The aperture is a mechanical iris that limits the amount of light that passes through the lens. Sometimes this is controlled with a manual ring, other times it's controlled electronically by the camera. So if we're using a faster shutter speed, we can open up the aperture to let more light in. Now the aperture value is typically measured in what's called f-stop, which is just a way to measure the amount of light that's being blocked from going through the lens. So the higher the f-stop means you're stopping more light. So the smaller the opening, the darker the image. The lower the f-stop, you're blocking less light, so the bigger the opening, the brighter the image. So we can use shutter speed and aperture in harmony with each other in order to achieve a balanced exposure of light. When you have a slower shutter speed, you can close down the aperture with a higher f-stop, and when you have a faster shutter speed, you can have a more open aperture with a lower f-stop. So it's a balancing act, and when you adjust one to restrict the light, you often need to counteract that by adjusting the other to allow more light. Now, one cool thing about aperture is it also controls the depth of field in a photo, which is how much of the photo will be in focus. So with a low f-stop like 2.0, you can get a narrow depth of field, which will give you a blurry background, which creates some nice separation between the subject and the background. So like in this shot right here, I'm at f2. So you can see my background is a little bit blurry, which gives some separation between me and the background. And with a higher f-stop, more of the image will be in focus, which is great for landscape photos. So not only do shutter speed and aperture control exposure, but they affect motion blur and depth of field as well. So wouldn't it be nice if there was yet another parameter you had control over to affect exposure so you could have even greater creative control? So for example, like what if you were shooting in a really dark room and you can't use a flash, and for whatever reason, and you wanted to have a high f-stop so everything was in focus, but you didn't want to slow the shutter speed too much because then you'd introduce too much motion blur. So you're in a situation where there simply isn't enough light to capture a well-exposed image. Well, there's a third parameter that controls exposure, and that is ISO. ISO controls the overall amplification of the light information that is captured by the image sensor. So in low light situations, you can increase the ISO to brighten the overall image that is saved to the camera when you're just not able to achieve the desired exposure through shutter speed and aperture alone. Now keep in mind, you typically want to shoot with a low ISO setting like 100 or 200 because the higher your ISO, the more noise, more grain, and more artifacts will be introduced into the image. But in really low light situations, bumping up your ISO to 3200, for example, will amplify the light signal just enough without introducing too much noise in order to get a good picture. And more expensive cameras can go really high, like 25,000 ISO, 80,000, or even higher, but you always want to try to shoot with the lowest ISO setting that you can get away with. All right, so here's an analogy to help solidify shutter speed, aperture, and ISO in your mind. So think about a garden hose with a sprayer attached. And this glass represents our camera sensor that is collecting light to create our image. Now, if we fill it just a little bit, that's like underexposing the image. If we fill it too much, that's like overexposing the image. So what we want to do is fill up this glass about halfway so we have a good balance between the light and dark areas of an image. So what controls do we have over the volume of water that's filling this glass? Well, we have the main valve, which let's just imagine it's either fully on or fully off. So it kind of represents the shutter. So the amount of time that I have this valve open represents the shutter speed on the camera. But we also have this adjustment on the front of the sprayer, and this controls the volume of water that comes out while the valve is open. So this is kind of like the aperture on your camera. So I could have this closed down really tight, and when I open the valve, there's just like a mist coming out. So in order to fill the glass halfway, I'd have to have the valve open for a very long time in order to fill it up. Or I could have the nozzle opened up really large, and I would only need to have the nozzle open for a very short amount of time in order to fill the glass. Now, to capture ISO in this analogy, I guess maybe we would use like a vase instead. So in order to fill the vase halfway with water, it takes a lot less volume. So we'd either have to shorten the duration that the valve is opened, or we'd have to close the nozzle down enough so we can keep the same fill duration. All right, I hope that analogy made sense. So those are the three basic principles of photography exposure. You've got shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And all three of those work together to control the exposure of your image. Now, the fourth bonus tip for controlling exposure that really isn't looked at in this way, it's not really talked about too much, but it's using filters, which are kind of like, sunglasses for your camera. So there's many situations where you want to have a shallow depth of field in direct sunlight, and you literally can't get your camera to shoot fast enough to have your aperture opened all the way so you can have that shallow depth of field. But by simply using a neutral density filter, you can darken the light that's coming into your lens just enough to be able to have a well-exposed image with a shallow depth of field. And of course, using flashes and artificial lights completely change the exposure equation, but that's a whole other topic for another video altogether. So now that you understand the basic principles of exposure, you can experiment with aperture priority, shutter priority, or manual control mode on your camera. So when you're shooting on auto, you're actually relying on the camera to set the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO for every single shot in order to produce what the camera software considers a well-exposed photo. So your camera has a light meter built in that measures the light in the scene, and it uses that information to adjust the settings. But the problem is your camera doesn't understand your composition. It doesn't know you're trying to shoot a moving object and therefore should have a faster shutter speed to reduce motion blur. It doesn't understand context, it just measures light. So instead, if you use a priority mode like shutter priority, you can take manual control just over the shutter speed, for instance, and let the camera adjust the aperture on the fly in order to have a well-lit photo. Now you can always adjust exposure compensation to manually brighten or darken the target exposure, or you can switch to full manual mode for complete manual control over aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. All right, that's all I have for you in this video. If you liked it, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions, leave a comment below, and I will see you in the next video.